My name is Bob Newton. As many of you who come to these events know, I'm the interim director of the Church in the 21st Century Center. And the center, as once again most of you know, but I see some new faces here, is its mission is to be a catalyst and a resource for the renewal of the Catholic Church. It was started, we're in our 9th years. It was started by Father Leahy, the president of Boston College, as a Boston College's response to the clerical sexual abuse crisis back 9 years ago. We have 4 focal issues: handing on the faith, see if I can remember them all, there are only 4. Handing on the faith, sexuality in the Catholic tradition, roles and relationships in the Church, and the Catholic intellectual tradition. The series this semester, the fall, is based on the C21 Resources theme of the Eucharist at the center of Catholic life. And our advisory committee said, when we were thinking about the kind of topics and speakers that we should have to fill this out or reaffirm this theme with on-campus events, one of their key recommendations was that we have a talk on how the Eucharist is related to social justice. I'm not going to introduce tonight's speaker. I'm going to introduce the person who's going to introduce tonight's speaker, and I'm pleased to do it. It's Meg Stapleton Smith, who is a member of the class of 2013. She's also a member of the Church in the 21st Century Center Advisory Board. She's a theology major with a double minor in faith, peace and justice, and Catholic studies. As a freshman, she joined Campus Ministries' Urban Immersion program. As a sophomore, she was off to West Virginia with the Appalachia Volunteers. And as a junior, next semester, she will be studying in El Salvador. So she's one of the vibrant young people who makes our center what it is. So I'd like to introduce Meg Stapleton Smith.
Thank you. It is an honor to be introducing Father Massaro tonight. Father Thomas Massaro is a Jesuit priest of the New England province who taught 11 years at Weston Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge before coming to BC in 2008. His work in Christian social ethics draws upon wide-ranging studies in political science, economics, philosophy, and theology. Through publications and lectures, he has addressed important issues like welfare reform, globalization, peacemaking, environmental concern, and ethics of voting and patriotism. Besides writing and teaching courses on Catholic social teaching, religion and public life, and ethical dimensions of the economy, Father Massaro seeks to maintain a commitment to hands-on social activism. He recently completed a term on the Peace Commission for the City of Cambridge and is a founding member of the Steering Committee of Catholic Scholars for Workers' Justice. Something you may not know about Father Massaro is that although from New York, he is an avid Red Sox fan, which I was pleased to hear, because that's myself as well. He's an avid bicyclist and a former national champion college debater at Amherst College, which is very impressive. So it's my pleasure. Please join me in welcoming Father Thomas Massaro.
I'm delighted to be with you tonight. Thank you, Megan, for your warm, maybe overly generous introduction, but I'll take it. I'm awfully glad to contribute and to have the opportunity to contribute my voice to this very good lecture series, which is entitled The Eucharist at the Center of Catholic Life. In one ways, my task is extremely easy. Everyone in the room is in favor of the Eucharist, I assume, right? Raise your hands. And everyone, I assume, is in favor of social justice, whatever we mean by that term. My simple goal is to connect those two things, the Eucharist and Catholic teachings on social justice. I want to connect them in a way that is not superficial, in a way that is satisfying, in a way that does justice to those two topics. While the task sounds simple, it may not be as easy as it sounds on the surface, because there is resistance to the connection here. There is some perception out there that there's a tension between the Eucharist and social justice. And let me get to this by just telling a little story, a little tableau, something that might happen, I don't know, somewhere over at McElroy or someplace where the campus ministry office is. Two students are walking down a hallway here at BC on a Friday afternoon, and one turns to the other and says, well, what are you doing tomorrow, Saturday? What are you doing with your free time? And assuming that these two students are kind of campus ministry brats or rats or whatever they're called, one might say to the other, oh, well, what I'm doing is I'm going downtown to the soup kitchen, and then right nearby there's a State House rally against cuts to social service programs, so I want to join that rally. And then I might go over to the financial district and join the Occupy Boston protest and demonstration. And the other one kind of rolls his eyes. And then the first one asks the second one, and what are you doing tomorrow? And the other one says, well, you know, it's Saturday, so there's, of course, choir rehearsal at noon, and then I'm going to help around the chapel and set up flower arrangements. I'm pretty good at floral arrangements. And then we have training for Eucharistic ministers right afterwards, so right there the day is shot. These are stereotyped answers. And frankly, I hope that there's time in a day for all 6 of those activities that I just mentioned. But they're stereotypes that there are different types of Catholics, those interested in one angle, one end of the spectrum, in things liturgical, the aesthetics, if you will, and others interested in social justice activities, ethics or activism, if you will. There's an imagined conflict between these priorities. And of course, all of us would be eager, I hope eager, to break down this false dichotomy, this either or, and to call it what it is. It's a both and. It's an exaggerated split that we as Catholics want to, I hope feel instinctively eager to break down and to combine those two, and to get rid of the simple simplifications. You're either a social justice Catholic or a liturgical enthusiast. This is a misperception. I would like to say that with these two counterclaims to this obvious stereotype, offer two counterclaims. And one, if you are indeed a social justice enthusiast, you absolutely need the Eucharist, and I would say frequent Eucharist, because where else would you possibly acquire the energy to do all the bewildering and demanding work of social justice? And my second counter-argument is this. If you really wish to celebrate the Eucharist correctly and authentically and even aesthetically in a pleasing way, you really need to also consider the social justice dimension of that sacrament, and I might add, all the sacraments. I'm actually going to spend the lion's share of the next 25 or 30 minutes talking about that second claim. I'll address the people who might just need a little clarification. It's kind of my exhortation. If you are enthusiastic about the Eucharist, if you want to celebrate it correctly and authentically, how is it, on what basis do I make the claim that social justice needs to be a part of that? That a standard part of all of our Eucharistic celebrations has to be concern for social justice. And by that I include a range of social concerns, including the value of social solidarity, responsibility for the poor, commitment to social change, to overcoming injustices, to alleviating problems in our world like hunger and desperate suffering, here and abroad. Now, I'm not claiming that social justice is the only dimension of the Eucharist. Like all the sacraments, the Holy Eucharist displays an inexhaustible surplus of meaning, to use a theological phrase. It cannot be reduced to a single image or a single meaning or a single metaphor. If you were to compile a list of all the possible understandings, images, metaphors, the meanings of the Eucharist, here would be my partial list. I'm going to list 10 really quickly. The Eucharist is a meal. It's a literal sharing of food, a breaking of bread. The Eucharist is a sacrifice. Those of us familiar with the old catechisms remember the phrase, it's the unbloody sacrifice of the body and blood of Christ. Third, it's a healing ritual, a ritual of forgiveness, a ritual of reconciliation, and one that we Catholics believe takes away our sins in some mysterious way. It's also a memorial of the Last Supper. It need not be a literal reenactment. We don't have to wear sandals and sit at a long table with 13 chairs, but it is a reenactment of the Last Supper. It's a reenactment or a memorial of a person, and that person, of course, is Jesus Christ and his suffering for us. It is a forming and a renewal of our covenant with God, renewing, formalizing our membership, our belonging in God's family. Seventh, it's an act of worship and an act of praise, which binds us with others, our fellow worshipers, in a community that comes together to acknowledge the God whom we believe created us, sustains us, redeems us, and draws us closer to him. It's a celebration of the mercy and forgiveness of a God whom we believe is compassionate and all-merciful. It is an experience of the real presence of Christ in a special way that's not available in other places and times. And 10th and finally, the Eucharist is a thanksgiving meal. That's the root meaning of the Greek word Eucharistia. So I've given you 10 quick sketches, just for one phrase each, for possible meanings of the Eucharist. It is all of these things, and it's many others as well. We'll never be able to pin down the totality of the Eucharist and what it means and signifies in our lives. When Jesus says, "Do this in memory of me," he's actually giving us a very complex command. It takes a lot of understanding, and we'll probably spend all eternity trying to unpack, and we'll never actually exhaust the full meaning and mystery of the Eucharist. One of my favorite authors, the late great theologian Monica Helwig, said, instead of expecting to grasp the Eucharist intellectually, it has a way of grasping us. Truer words were never spoken, Monica Helwig. I want to avoid an overly strong claim that the Eucharist is exclusively about social justice, but I do want to clear out some space among all those 10 or more understandings of the Eucharist for social justice being an important, indispensable aspect of what we do around the liturgical act, around the Eucharistic table, around the altar, every time we go to Mass. Let me begin by calling attention to, it's a key dimension of my argument, and it's probably the most obvious thing that there is about the Eucharist. When we gather for Eucharist, we gather in an assembly, a group of people. It's not just one person for Mass. It's a communal dimension. From the very beginning of Christianity, when there weren't churches, established churches, big cathedrals, they were simply house masses. People gathered in groups, small or large. I think we'd look kind of silly if it was just one person celebrating the Eucharist, although that does happen. This reminds me of a story of a recent student at Boston College who came to me asking me to direct his studies. He had been a priest for almost a decade and wanted to come back to school, get another degree during a sabbatical year, and he did. It all worked out well. And at the end of that, he wanted to write a thesis. And I asked him, well, what would you like to write this thesis about? And he said, pet peeves of mine. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And I said, well, what are your pet peeves? Well, and he went on to explain, I'll give you the short version. I've been celebrating Eucharist in a parochial setting. It's in another state, it's not from Massachusetts, for many years now. And I have been compiling a list of pet peeves. My main pet peeves, and I want to write a thesis about this, is where people choose to sit during Mass. You recognize this? What am I going to say? First of all, like all good Catholics, his parishioners for a decade now have always chosen to sit in the back. He actually got to the point where he cordoned off the back chair so they had to come forward. But the most interesting part of his thesis, it was an entire chapter, by the way. It was a chapter, and I don't have the exact title, but I think it went by these 3 words: maximum liturgical entropy. Do you know what I mean? Any physics people out there? Entropy is that physical law where things go to the maximum disorganization and distance from each other. I think it's like molecules in a substance or something. And his pet peeve was when he celebrates a liturgy and it's not a crowded church, the people sitting out there sit as far away from each other as physically possible in the congregation. Have you ever been to a Mass where there's 30 or 40 people and a big congregation that could seat 300 or 400? And you turn around for the sign of peace and you realize that there's not a single person within arm's length of you, right? And you can't even reach out a hand to handshake. They're just too far away. And maybe you could blame yourself too. I could blame myself on occasion too. I just want to be alone. And so people kind of nod or they wave to each other. That's not a very good substitute for the kiss of peace, right? The distress that my student felt was a frustration that probably all of us feel at one time or another. And it's a small thing. But think of the number of distressing points, because the Eucharist has a great potential to break down barriers, and somehow we allow them to continue the barriers of privacy, etc. Eucharist has a capacity to be a perfect antidote to the separation that we experience in the modern world, the loneliness, the narcissism, the self-centeredness of modern life today. It's an odd and self-defeating behavior to keep in Eucharist the same mindset of individualism or even narcissism that we have in a mall. I just want to be left alone. I just want to window shop. That's not what Eucharist is about. Eucharist, this may seem like a small point, but I think it's emblematic. If Eucharist doesn't draw us together, then we're missing a real potential of what it could do in our lives to transform us. So it's odd and self-defeating behavior. But at stake in the Eucharist and social justice is more than just what our experience is, just for me, the therapeutic, more than what it does for us, whether it feels good for me. Eucharist must live up to its communal dimension. It must really, in order to be truly at the center of Catholic life, we need to see in the Eucharist a pledge to care about the well-being of every person in the world. Certainly those in the Eucharistic assembly with us in our church on a Sunday or any other day, but also to extend this pledge of care, of concern, of social justice to everyone, and not just in our country, not in just our society, but all of God's children, wherever they are, whatever their circumstance. If Eucharist is really to be at the center of Catholic life, then part of its function is to be a continual reminder of the social dimension of life, to care about others wherever they are. And my summary of that is to say this: fidelity to the sacrament includes fidelity to a social commitment, to, again, care about the well-being of all. And this constitutes for me a call to look outward, to avoid any kind of myopia, of short-sightedness, where we really only have our in-group or our own family, our own neighborhood in mind. As we share the Eucharistic meal, our attention should naturally turn to others around us and around the world. Do they have a meal? A spiritual meal like the Eucharist, and a physical meal like the 3 meals a day that we Americans can afford, but cannot be said about most people around the world. If we are truly in a meaningful communion with these people, all God's children, then we should care about their spiritual as well as their material hungers. Are their hungers being satisfied? And if not, something is wrong. Something in the world is amiss, and our Eucharist, I think, points to a solution or a resolution. A key word here is solidarity. Solidarity is a surprisingly recent term. In fact, until the French Revolution, it wasn't commonly used. You all know the French Revolutionary slogan, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. Solidarity is a translation of that third term. We all know that many sociologists in the 19th and 20th centuries used that word, Emil Durkheim and Max Weber and others. We also know that our late great Pope John Paul II made a slogan, kind of a buzzword out of solidarity, in line with his countryman, Lech Walesa of Poland, who started the Solidarity movement and brought it to an amazing conclusion with the downfall of communism. The word solidarity that we use in the Catholic community is related to the word more often heard in the Protestant world, fellowship. I don't hear that word as often in Catholic circles as I do in Protestant ones. Fellowship, solidarity. It's also related to the theme of hospitality. Physical care for others. When they come to your house, do you offer them amenities? Do you offer them food? The word hospitality and the notion of hospitality has deep roots in the gospel. Think of any of the parables that Jesus preached. The parable of the Good Samaritan is a good example. The parable of Lazarus and Dives, the rich man. The parable of the final judgment in Matthew 25. All of them talk about service to others and the idea that we will be rewarded for service to others and perhaps punished for failing to serve the poor, the hungry, the needy among us. The point in all of this talk of solidarity is that we are one human family. We need to overcome whatever artificial divisions divide us into nations or classes or ethnic or racial groups. Our destiny at the end of time is to be one, a one united human family, to partake together without distinctions in an eschatological banquet at the end of time, God's kingdom. And that banquet has a foretaste every Sunday, every time we gather around an altar and share communion. It's a foretaste of God's kingdom. It's a foretaste of heaven. Let me just say a few words about our culture by way of cultural analysis, our social context today. Well, obviously, we live in a world of great individualism. There's a tendency towards a kind of a centrifugal force, isn't there? That we don't really belong together, that we can kind of escape and do things on our own terms. The conventional wisdom is to follow the dictates of economic self-interest, to look out for number one. The problem with this is, although it's a cultural imperative, looking out for number one, it's not a gospel imperative. In fact, it's the direct antithesis of the gospel message, to care for others and to follow the love of Christ and the gospel's call to love our neighbors as a result. Without much further social analysis of American society today, we could all do that. I believe we have lost a sense of the commons, of a common life. And we need to revive, restore, rekindle a sense of the communal. And I think our society needs to do some remedial work on common good and the communal. The Christian community, by way of contrast, of course, should be a centripetal place where we seek the center, not seek to flee off to our own comfortable corners and cocoons. We should seek the common benefit. We should recognize and enhance interdependence in our world, engagement with others, and a consideration of their needs, not just our own. Just think of our liturgical greeting that we use several times in every liturgy. The Lord be with you. We're extending concern. We want the Lord to be with you. It expresses an effort to reach out. In fact, the entire movement of the Mass, all parts of the Mass, from the liturgy of the Word to the liturgy of the Eucharist, and certainly in that final blessing and sending forth to love and to serve the Lord and one another, is to receive a blessing and then to spread the blessing. That's the liturgical movement. We receive from God, we experience a blessing, and we seek to reach out the hand to others. What is the point of a liturgy unless we can become a blessing for others, unless we can become a conduit for God's loving care, concern, and saving action for all people? The liturgy is not about gathering up and even hoarding grace. The liturgy is about sharing it, taking God's gift and being fortunate enough to be in a position to give it all away. We obviously need some further antidotes to a privatized spirituality, the kind of me and Jesus style that my thesis writing priest student talked about before. A style of personal piety, perhaps, that might be good on some levels, but ultimately it fails because it ignores others. It doesn't reach out to others. Another chapter of my friend's thesis included parish activities, programs, and he asked a really hard question in that chapter. If you never reach out to your fellow worshipers, if church is just kind of a fueling station on a Sunday morning and nothing else, if you never join in a parish charitable activity or even a social function at the parish, then something is clearly missing in your understanding, and I would add, in your Eucharistic understanding, your practice of what it means to be a Catholic Christian. It's a missed opportunity to connect with people. It's certainly a missed opportunity to learn from people. So far, I've been talking mostly in generalities about linking the Eucharist and this communal dimension, solidarity. The next step is to address what I call the urgency of making these connections. It is urgent because we live in a troubled world where people are literally starving. There is a Eucharistic imperative to care for others, not to be self-contained, to care not only about ourselves or individually or in a small group, but about the whole world. This command is most obvious when we consider world hunger. just to say the obvious. The Eucharist feeds our spiritual hunger, but the physical hunger of billions of people in this world, many of whom experience food insecurity, a crisis of hunger. Think of what's happening in northeastern Africa right now, Ethiopia and areas around Sudan and Somalia. The billions who are chronically malnourished. People who share communion, our spiritual food, are energized to do something to relieve suffering anywhere in the world. Not just energized, I would say, but obligated. We can never forget the people who have too little food to sustain themselves, while we, Americans, frankly, have too much food, too much availability of food that's probably not so good for us. We must always make the obvious connection between the bread and wine on our altars and the hunger in the bellies of the world's poor. It would not only be a failure of imagination, but really a serious moral failure to let that disconnect continue and to neglect this connection. The simple fact then, the hunger of others counts for Catholics, for all Christians. Anyone in the world who's suffering, their suffering and hunger is against the will of God. In the Lord's Prayer, we say, "Give us this day our daily bread." We take that line for granted, but we cannot in good conscience limit the quest for bread to our own table. We have to reach out to others. Then the issue of blame sometimes comes up. The poor sometimes, they're to be blamed for their own poverty. They didn't finish school. They didn't live in the right place. We could talk about this for a long time. There's plenty of blame to go around for world hunger, for the suffering that goes on, in the economic and political systems that render people victims of an economy. But we could really model our concern upon the works of Jesus, who fed 5,000. We could model our social concern upon the works of Jesus, who healed people, who offered them healings and exorcisms whenever he was called upon. Jesus never blamed the victims, the people he touched, for their sufferings. And he never exonerated those who stood passively by and watched suffering occur in a callous way. All of this kind of exegesis of the Gospels suggests that a lot of suffering is caused by sin, a lot of it is caused by selfishness, and the Gospels actually offer us a very good model of issues regarding social responsibility. If we had more time, I could talk about social justice from the standpoint of Catholic social teaching, from different theologians, even more parts of the Bible. All of these sources, if we compiled more of them, would tell us the same thing. The Eucharist points to an alternative lifestyle, not to conformity to society as we know it. It offers a counter-narrative, something different. It challenges the injustices and the discrimination that we experience in our world. The gospel is about, and the Eucharist is about, meeting human hungers and needs. It's not about success in market society. It's more than simply abiding by the social conventions, going along with the crowd. A proper understanding of the Eucharist challenges us to reject that false split between the public and the private, where religion is relegated to a private sphere and doesn't have any input, any traction in public events. If your religious practice becomes overly removed from daily life, it's overly churchy or privatized or separated from public life, then it's worth re-examining the roots of social concern that lie in the Eucharist, as we've been talking about it. This is a call to bring your Eucharistic faith into the public sphere, by all means. Can I use a 6-syllable word? This will be the longest word I use today as a theologian. I try to restrain myself. Transubstantiation. We've gone 25 minutes and we haven't used the word transubstantiation. Perhaps it's surprising, but the theological tradition uses the word transubstantiation to describe what happens to the elements, the bread and wine, at the Eucharist on the table at Mass. But the notion of transformation should not be reserved simply to, again, the host and a chalice of wine, which becomes the body and blood of Christ. An equally remarkable transformation is that which occurs within the hearts of all people who witness the Eucharistic action, who share the Eucharistic meal. It's an action of conversion of spirit. The assembly is transformed. St. Augustine's famous line, "Become what you receive, the body and blood of Christ." Become the body of Christ and act like Christ. I'd like to turn from the features of the Eucharist to briefly just note something about the frequency of the Eucharist. People ask me all the time, why do we have to go to Mass every week? Why do we have to do this ritual action quite so often? And my answer is always the same. Because we are forgetful creatures, because we lose sight so easily of so many important things about our faith. The Eucharistic prayer that the priest says at the time of consecration is the perfect antidote to our forgetfulness. Hearing it dozens and dozens and hundreds of times over a lifetime reminds us of the economy of salvation. It reminds us of the movements of salvation history. The texts of all the Eucharistic prayers used at Mass include the dangerous memory of the passion and death of Jesus Christ, the ways that he challenged the authorities and the establishments of his time and sided radically with the poor, the outcast, and the sinners. We live in a culture that's very much live for the moment, and so we certainly need this reminder. And it's a reminder that includes the insight that death is not the end, that there are things worth doing that don't fit maybe the model of consumerism that dominates our society, that doesn't fit the therapeutic model that always turns us to the idea of, what's good for me and what feels good. It's a reminder of the infinite power of love and compassion to overcome sin and selfishness and the tendency to isolate ourselves. A different world is possible. A different experience of daily life is possible if we walk the way of Christ. Again, if I had more time, I could probably back up my points with lots of citations from Scripture. I recommend checking out the letter of James in the New Testament. I could back it up by more words of St. Paul. I could back it up by some of the writings of the Church Fathers. Check out St. John Chrysostom, 3rd, 4th century saint, who railed against the excesses and the inequities of rich and poor in his time. Certainly St. Paul in his anger against the Corinthians, check out 1 Corinthians chapter 11, who he accuses them of celebrating the Eucharist unworthily because they exclude the poorest among them from the full sharing of the meal. It wouldn't be hard to find numerous quotes from all these saints and from church councils, but it's really not necessary to do so. It would clutter my argument. The authority of linking the Eucharist and social justice is an internal authority, not an external one. It lies in the very meaning, and I hope that you experience, in the very experience of the Eucharist itself. Now, I suppose I'm preaching to the choir because who else would be in Gasson 100 on a Thursday afternoon? And I'm sure it's not just for the pizza. You're probably easily sold on this linkage, and the importance of the Eucharist is probably something that every single one of you could talk about eloquently as well. If you want further inspiration, though, check out the words, the lyrics, the texts of the songs that we sing in church at the time of the Eucharist. They include phrases like, all are welcome, and table of plenty. They include images of unity, like one bread and one body, or phrases like the sacrament of unity. They include verbs like sharing and offering and even yearning. Now, we're in the home stretch here. I just want to summarize a little bit of what we've said and end on a final note. The Eucharist, we agree, is a deeply communal sacrament with profound social implications. The more seriously we take the Eucharist, the more potentially subversive it is, changing us, this Christian practice changing and challenging our social conventions, and never allowing us to forget the needs of others and the hunger that exists in the midst of this troubled world. After all, by practicing the Eucharist, are following a Savior who sounded quite firm as he stated that it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for the rich to inherit the kingdom of God. Ponder that. I'm not exactly sure what Jesus meant by that, but I think it had something to, certainly it includes the idea that we are all called to detach ourselves somewhat from wealth, from privilege, and to use the wealth, power, and privilege that we do have to put them at the service of the truly needy in our midst, and maybe it calls us to live the lives of greater simplicity and humility. This is all challenging stuff. I make no pretense about it. It may ask us to ask some hard questions. Here are 4 brief questions that we might ask ourselves based on this connection of Eucharist and social justice. First, do we always find ourselves worshiping with people of the same socioeconomic status as us? Secondly, do we ever seek out mixed congregations, deliberately choosing to pray and to share the Eucharist with people of other ethnic groups, classes, races? It takes effort to do this. Third, do we put the spiritual graces and energies that we receive in the Eucharist to the service of the poor and the marginalized in the world? Fourth and finally, what can I, any of us, realistically do to broaden our table fellowship and to deepen the bonds of solidarity, there's that word again, solidarity, with those in need? Now, I won't pretend that I have any answers to these questions. They're not easy questions. They're hard questions, but I think that's the point. Obviously, the possibilities of finding these meanings in the Eucharist are deeper than any one of us usually discovers, deeper than any of us realizes in the regular liturgies that we experience at parishes, here on the campus, or anywhere. We're simply not reaching the maximum potential of the rich meanings of the Eucharist and linking our Eucharistic participation with our love of neighbors near or far. Do I have any suggestions for improvement in our practices? I'll just offer this. Maybe we need more intentional planning and enactment to bring out the social justice dimensions of our liturgies and to make these linkages more explicit. We all want to make liturgies more aesthetically pleasing. We should also want to make them more ethically satisfying, even exciting, to be less mundane and less boring. That includes working to make them more oriented towards social justice with social concern and social responsibilities. So in closing, I'll just re-evoke that image of the two students walking around the corridors of a building on this campus talking about their plans for a Saturday. And I hope that I've done a little bit to break down the stereotypes, to imagine that somebody can care both about floral arrangements and choir rehearsals, as well as social justice and social activism. That the Eucharist is a place for common ground, that it really isn't a dividing thing, it should be something that brings us together, and that all of us should care about both Eucharist, liturgy, good liturgy, aesthetically pleasing liturgy, and social justice. If we do that, we're placing liturgy, we're placing the Eucharist at the center of our Catholic lives. Thank you very much.